On a cold night somewhere along the Danube, in a tent surrounded by the sounds of a Roman army settling in for winter, the most powerful man on earth sat down and wrote a note to himself. Not a decree, not a letter to the Senate, not a message to be read by generals or governors or the trembling ambassadors of client kingdoms. He wrote a private reminder, the kind of thing a person scrawls on the back of their hand so they don't forget it by morning. He told himself to rise early because the work of being a human being was waiting for him, and that lying under warm blankets was more pleasant, yes, but it was not what he was made for. He told himself this the way you might tell yourself the same thing after a bad night's sleep in the dark, half annoyed at your own body for resisting the day. Picture the actual scene for a moment, because it matters. This is not a marble palace. It is a leather tent somewhere in what is now Austria or Hungary or Slovakia, in territory the Romans thought of as the ragged, dangerous edge of the civilized world. Outside, thousands of soldiers are trying to survive a winter far from home, many of them sick, many of them grieving comrades lost earlier that year, all of them a long way from certain they will see Rome again. Inside, by the light of an oil lamp, a 50-something man with a graying beard, worn down by 2 decades of nearly uninterrupted crisis, is not drafting a law or dictating a letter to a secretary. He is alone with a wax tablet or a sheet of papyrus, and he is doing something almost embarrassingly ordinary, trying to talk himself out of hitting the snooze button, so to speak, on a day he does not particularly want to face. This is strange enough on its own, but the man writing it was Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor of Rome, ruler of some 70 million people, commander of legions, the final word in matters of law, war, marriage, inheritance, life, and death across 3 continents. And he was not writing for us. He had no idea that 2,000 years later, strangers on the other side of an ocean he never knew existed would read his private doubts on glowing screens, would highlight his sentences, would tattoo fragments of his insecurities onto their skin. He thought he was alone. He thought these words would die with him, or with the papyrus they were written on, forgotten in some archive or burned in some fire, as almost everything from the ancient world eventually was. He was wrong. And the fact that he was wrong is precisely what makes the book he left behind one of the strangest and most intimate documents in the whole of human history. We call it Meditations now, though that title was invented by someone else, centuries later, trying to give shape to what is really a loose, repetitive, sometimes contradictory series of notes. Marcus himself, if he gave it any title at all, seems to have called it something closer to things addressed to himself. Not a book of wisdom to be handed down. Not a philosophical treatise meant to win arguments or convert the doubtful. A private conversation between a man and the parts of his own mind he did not trust. To understand why an emperor would need to talk himself into getting out of bed, you have to understand what his life had actually become by the time he was writing these words. And to understand that, you have to go back much further, to a boy who never expected to rule anything at all. He was born in the year 121 in a wealthy Roman household on the Caelian Hill, to a family with old money and modest political weight, nothing that would suggest the throne. His father died when he was a small child, young enough that Marcus later admitted he barely remembered the man's face, only impressions handed down by others, a reputation for modesty, for keeping his emotions to himself, for not showing off. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was wealthy in her own right, from a family that had made a fortune in the brick and tile business, unglamorous, practical wealth, the kind that built the actual physical fabric of Rome rather than simply displaying status. She raised him with what he later described as a mixture of religious devotion, generosity, and a horror of both extravagance and cruelty. It was, by the standards of Roman aristocracy, a fairly plain upbringing for someone who lived in that kind of comfort. What set the boy apart early was not ambition. It was a strange, almost old-fashioned seriousness. While other children of his class chased chariot races and gladiatorial spectacles, young Marcus developed an appetite for philosophy that alarmed and amused the adults around him in roughly equal measure. By the age of 12, he had taken up the dress and habits of a philosopher in training: a coarse cloak, a hard bed on the ground instead of a soft mattress, deliberate small deprivations meant to toughen the will. His mother, worried he was damaging his health, had to talk him into sleeping on an animal skin instead of the bare floor. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A 12-year-old Roman aristocrat, born into every comfort his world had to offer, voluntarily giving pieces of it up because some instinct in him already suspected that comfort and character were not the same thing and might even be enemies. He studied under a series of tutors, and it's from their letters and his own later writing that we get a picture of a young man who was, frankly, a little strange in the way that unusually earnest people often are. One of his early teachers, Diognetus, introduced him to philosophy and, apparently, to the plain, unadorned Greek writing style that would define his own private voice for the rest of his life. No ornament, no rhetorical flourish, just the thought stripped down to its bones. Another, a rhetoric teacher named Cornelius Fronto, became something closer to a second father, and the surviving letters show a warmth and playful affection that make Marcus feel, for a moment, almost like an ordinary young man, teasing, affectionate, worried about his friend's health, complaining about the tedium of his studies. But the person who would shape him most was a Stoic philosopher named Junius Rusticus, whom Marcus later credited with something like a conversion experience. Rusticus was older, already an established statesman and philosopher by the time he began teaching the young heir, and Marcus, in his private notebook, thanks him for several very specific things, for showing him, through his own example, that a person's character actually needed improving and correcting rather than simply being admired from a distance, for keeping him away from the shallow performance of philosophy that was fashionable in some circles, the kind of showy public lecturing designed to impress an audience rather than genuinely change the speaker, and in a detail that has struck generations of later readers as almost unbearably intimate, for personally lending Marcus his own private copy of the notes taken from Epictetus' lectures, rather than sending him off to acquire a published edition through the usual channels. There is something quietly moving in this small transaction, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The book that would eventually reshape the emperor's entire inner life first reached him not as a public text bought or borrowed from a library, but as a personal object handed directly from one man's hands to another's, the way a favorite worn paperback gets passed between friends today. It was Rusticus who introduced him to the private notebooks of a philosopher named Epictetus, a man whose life could not have been more different from Marcus's own. Epictetus had been born a slave. He had lived his early life owned by a secretary to the Emperor Nero, a man known for casual brutality, who at one point, according to later tradition, deliberately broke Epictetus's leg, and the philosopher is said to have observed, without particular anger, that the leg was now broken, simply noting the fact, refusing to add suffering to injury by raging against what could not be changed. Whether or not that specific story is embellished, the philosophy Epictetus built from his own suffering was unmistakably real, a teaching that insisted the only thing truly ours, the only thing genuinely within our control, is the space between what happens to us and how we choose to respond to it. Everything else, our body, our property, our reputation, even our own children, belong, in the end, to fortune, to time, to forces outside ourselves. Cling to none of it as though it were truly yours, Epictetus taught, and you will never be enslaved by its loss. The seriousness with which young Marcus took all of this did not go unnoticed by the people around him, and not always kindly. Wearing a philosopher's rough cloak in a household as wealthy as his own invited a certain amount of raised eyebrows, the ancient equivalent of a teenager showing up to a formal dinner in second-hand clothes on principle. His tutor Fronto, who loved him and worried about him in roughly equal measure, wrote letters gently teasing him for his devotion to Stoic austerity, half joking that all this philosophy was making the boy dull and pale, urging him to spend a little more time on rhetoric, a little less on logic chopping. Their correspondence, much of which survives, shows something rare in the historical record, a genuinely warm friendship between a teacher and a student who would go on to rule the world, full of small complaints about head colds, requests for updates on each other's health, and the kind of affectionate ribbing that only exists between people who trust each other completely. In one letter, young Marcus writes to Fronto in a state of near panic because his old teacher has fallen ill, confessing that he could barely eat or sleep for worry, that the news reached him at dinner and he lost his appetite on the spot. This is not the voice of a distant future emperor. It is the voice of a devoted, anxious student, terrified of losing someone he loves. It is one of history's better ironies that the philosophy which would guide an emperor's entire inner life was built by a man who had spent years in chains. Marcus, born to wealth he never had to fight for, found his deepest teacher in a man born with nothing, who had been beaten, owned, and discarded by people very much like the family Marcus himself belonged to. When Marcus later wrote again and again about not being troubled by what other people do, about controlling only his own judgments and nothing else, he was not inventing something new. He was rehearsing lessons written down by a former slave decades earlier in a small dusty room for an audience of students who could never have imagined those words would one day steady the mind of the most powerful man alive. The path to the throne itself began almost by accident, in the way that a great deal of Roman succession worked, less like a coronation and more like a slow-motion adoption scheme engineered by an aging, childless emperor trying to secure the empire's future. Before any of that, though, the boy had already caught the eye of the reigning emperor Hadrian, for reasons that say something about how unusual he was even as a child. Hadrian, a man famous for his sharp tongue and his fondness for clever wordplay, is said to have nicknamed the young Marcus Verissimus, something close to the most truthful one, a pun on his actual family name, Verus, but also, apparently, a genuine observation about the boy's character. Even as a child moving through the highest circles of Roman aristocracy, a world built substantially on flattery, performance, and careful self-interest, Marcus had apparently developed a reputation for a kind of blunt, almost inconvenient honesty. Hadrian, who missed very little, noticed it, and seems to have quietly begun considering the boy's future well before anyone else in Rome would have thought to. Hadrian's own health was failing by the early 130s, and the question of succession had become urgent and complicated in the way that Roman succession so often was, since the empire had no fixed hereditary system and depended instead on each emperor choosing, adopting, and grooming a successor, a system that worked well when the emperor chose wisely and catastrophically when he did not. Hadrian's first choice, a charming, sickly aristocrat named Lucius Ceionius Commodus, was adopted as heir with the name Lucius Aelius, and Marcus, then still a teenager, was betrothed to the man's daughter as part of the arrangement. A political marriage contract dissolved almost as quickly as it was made once Lucius Aelius died of illness before ever taking the throne. Hadrian, now dying himself and running out of time, needed a new solution, and the one he settled on was unusually elaborate. He would adopt a respected, uncontroversial senator named Antoninus, on the explicit condition that Antoninus, in turn, adopt both the son of the now-dead Lucius Aelius and the 17-year-old Marcus, effectively planning 2 generations of succession in a single afternoon. It was, in its way, an extraordinary act of trust in a boy Hadrian barely knew personally, based on little more than a reputation for honesty and a handful of impressions gathered at court. Marcus, for his part, seems to have had no say in any of it. The entire architecture of his future life was decided by other men in rooms he was not present for, while he was still young enough that the decision must have felt, at the time, like something happening to him rather than something he had any part in choosing. Almost overnight, the 17-year-old went from an earnest young student of philosophy to the presumptive heir of the entire Roman world. Later writers described him as showing little enthusiasm for the honor. One account claims he wept when informed of his new status, not from joy but from something closer to dread, and had to be persuaded by his household to move into the imperial residence at all. It is difficult to know how much of this to trust. Ancient biography loved a good origin story, and the reluctant ruler who never wanted power is one of its favorite shapes. But it fits everything else we know about him. This was not a man hungry for a throne. This was a man who had built his entire sense of self around a philosophy that treated power, status, and public honor as indifferent things, not evil, not to be refused, but not worth wanting either, and who was then handed, almost as a formality, more power than nearly any human being in history had ever possessed. For 23 years, from the age of 17 until Antoninus Pius's death in 161, Marcus served an unusually long apprenticeship for power. He was given real responsibilities, worked alongside the emperor, learned the administrative machinery of the empire from the inside, and by every surviving account developed a deep respect for the older man's quiet, careful style of governing, a style built on patience, restraint, and an almost obsessive resistance to unnecessary cruelty or spectacle. He was given real responsibilities, worked alongside the emperor, learned the administrative machinery of the empire from the inside, and by every surviving account developed a deep respect for the older man's quiet, careful style of governing, a style built on patience, restraint, and an almost obsessive resistance to unnecessary cruelty or spectacle. In his private notebook, years later, Marcus devotes an unusually long and detailed passage to cataloguing exactly what he admired in Antoninus, and the list is worth pausing on because it reads less like a eulogy and more like a set of instructions Marcus was still trying to follow. He praises the older man's refusal to be swayed by flatterers, his willingness to listen carefully to unwelcome advice and change course when he was shown to be wrong, his indifference to the trappings of luxury even though every luxury in the empire was available to him, and his habit of finishing the state's business efficiently so that he was never rushed or harried, never needing to make an important decision in a panic. Marcus notes, almost wistfully, that Antoninus rarely needed to be reminded of his duty because he had already thought it through beforehand, the opposite, it seems, of how Marcus often experienced his own mind, which needed constant reminding, constant re-persuading, night after night on the very same points. It is one of the clearer moments in the notebook where Marcus is not simply working through abstract philosophy but measuring himself explicitly against a real person he had loved and watched closely for over 2 decades, and finding the comparison humbling. When Antoninus finally died, his last recorded word, given to the officer of the guard who asked for the night's watchword, was simply equanimity, a single word summarizing an entire philosophy of rule, passed like a baton to the man who would follow him. Marcus became emperor in the year 161, and almost immediately, the world he inherited began to come apart. It is worth pausing here to notice something about the way we usually imagine Roman emperors. We picture triumph, marble, gold, the roar of crowds in the Colosseum, a life of imperial ease interrupted occasionally by conveniently dramatic events. Marcus Aurelius's actual reign looked almost nothing like that. It looked like nearly 2 decades of unbroken crisis. Within a year of taking power, the Parthian Empire to the east invaded Roman territory, triggering a war that would drag on for years. Marcus, uninterested in personal military glory and perhaps genuinely unsuited to it, sent his adoptive brother and co-emperor, Lucius Verus, to lead the campaign, while he himself remained in Rome managing the machinery of state. The war was eventually won, but the soldiers returning from the Eastern Front brought something back with them that no army could defeat, a plague, likely smallpox or something closely related, that tore through the Roman world with a violence the empire had never experienced. Modern historians call it the Antonine Plague, and its death toll is almost impossible to overstate. Estimates range into the millions, cutting through cities, legions, and the imperial household alike. It weakened the army at the exact moment new threats were gathering on the northern frontier. It emptied farmland of laborers. It filled the roads with the sick and the fleeing. Ancient writers described bodies carried out of houses on carts because there weren't enough mourners left standing to bury them individually. Marcus's own physician during these years was Galen, one of the most important medical writers in the ancient world, and Galen's surviving accounts give us a rare, unsettling window into the physical texture of what the empire was living through. He describes fever, black pustules covering the body, a stench so severe that soldiers avoided the sick, and mortality on a scale the Roman world had no real precedent for. Galen, notably, fled Rome for a period when the plague first struck the city, a decision he later had to explain away as necessary travel rather than simple flight, which tells you something about how frightening the disease actually was, even to the man whose profession was treating it. Entire units of the Roman army were reportedly incapacitated. Convoys of grain and supplies were disrupted as the laborers who moved them sickened or died. Even the class distinctions that usually protected the wealthy from the worst of Roman life gave way somewhat here. The disease did not particularly care whether it was killing a senator or a slave, a legionary or a farmer's child, and for a population that had built an entire social order around the idea that status offered protection, that alone was destabilizing. One episode from these campaigns became famous enough to survive in multiple ancient accounts and even, later, in Christian tradition, though the details vary depending on who is telling it. During a battle against the Quadi, a Germanic tribe, Roman forces are said to have found themselves surrounded, exhausted, and dying of thirst in punishing summer heat, cut off from water and facing near certain defeat when a sudden, violent storm broke over the battlefield, drenching the Roman soldiers with rain they desperately needed while lightning and hail scattered the enemy forces around them. Roman writers credited the deliverance to Marcus's own prayers to the traditional gods, or to Egyptian magic performed by a philosopher in his retinue. Later Christian writers, eager to claim credit for their own faith, insisted the storm had come in answer to the prayers of Christian soldiers serving in the legion, and pointed to it for generations afterward as evidence of divine favor. Marcus himself, so far as the record shows, never definitively settled the question in his own writing, and the surviving column erected in Rome to commemorate his northern wars depicts the storm as the work of a rain god hovering above the battle with arms outstretched, water pouring from his beard onto the grateful soldiers below. Whatever actually happened on that battlefield, the fact that three different religious traditions all rushed to claim the same downpour as evidence of their own god's favor tells you something about how desperate, how nearly miraculous, that particular moment of survival must have felt to the men who lived through it. While the plague burned through the empire, war broke out again, this time in the north, along the Danube frontier, where a coalition of Germanic tribes pushed across the river in numbers Rome hadn't seen in generations. This was not a distant colonial skirmish. This was an existential threat to the Italian peninsula itself. At one particularly dark moment, enemy raiders penetrated deep enough into Roman territory that the very safety of northern Italy seemed genuinely uncertain. Marcus, a man who had spent his entire youth in libraries and lecture halls, a man whose deepest loves were philosophy and quiet study, was forced to leave Rome and spend most of the remainder of his life commanding armies on a cold, muddy, disease-ridden frontier hundreds of miles from everything familiar to him. Marcus did not carry this alone at first. His adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, ruled beside him as co-emperor for the first 8 years of his reign, a genuinely unusual arrangement in Roman history, two men sharing the highest office with what appears, from the surviving evidence, to have been real trust rather than rivalry. Verus was, by most accounts, everything Marcus was not: fond of chariot racing, theatre, hunting, and the pleasures of court life, a man who enjoyed being emperor in a way Marcus temperamentally never quite could. Rather than resent this difference, Marcus appears to have relied on it, letting Verus handle the Eastern campaign and its accompanying pageantry while he managed the grinding administrative work in Rome. It was a partnership that, against the usual pattern of Roman power-sharing arrangements curdling into betrayal, seems to have worked. Then, in the year 169, while the two men were travelling together back toward Rome from the northern front, Verus suffered what ancient sources describe as a stroke, collapsing suddenly in his carriage and died within days. Marcus, by every account, was devastated, not the practiced grief of a public figure performing loss for an audience, but something that reads, even through the flattening lens of ancient biography, as real. He is said to have wept openly, to have refused food, to have insisted on accompanying the body back to Rome himself rather than sending it ahead. From that point forward, for the final 11 years of his life, Marcus ruled entirely alone, with no one to share the weight of the office, no other emperor's judgment to lean on, no partner left who understood, from the inside, exactly what the job actually cost. It was after this, in the years of solitary rule on an increasingly desperate frontier, that the private notebook seems to have become something closer to a necessity than a habit. It was here, in a military tent between campaigns against tribes with names most of his own soldiers could barely pronounce, that Marcus began keeping the private notes that would eventually become meditations. And this is where the strangeness of the book really begins to reveal itself, because almost nothing in it discusses any of this directly. You will search Meditations in vain for a blow-by-blow account of the Marcomannic Wars, for court gossip, for the names of specific battles or victories. What you find instead is something much smaller, much stranger, and much more intimate, a man arguing with his own mind. He reminds himself over and over not to be surprised when people behave badly, because expecting otherwise is itself a kind of foolishness, as foolish, he tells himself, as being shocked that a fig tree produces figs. He reminds himself that the people who annoy him, who betray him, who act with cruelty or stupidity or self-interest are doing so out of their own confusion about what is actually good, not out of some special malice aimed at him personally, and that understanding this should soften anger rather than excuse it, and free him rather than trap him in resentment. He reminds himself again and again, in dozens of different phrasings, that death is not something to be feared as an enemy, but simply a natural process, no different in kind from the changes his own body has already gone through 1,000 times since childhood, that the boy he once was has already died 100 small deaths on the way to becoming the man writing these words, and that the final death is only one more transformation among many, not a uniquely terrible exception. Scholars who study the notebook closely have noticed that underneath its apparent randomness, Marcus keeps returning to roughly 3 recurring exercises drilled into him originally through Epictetus' teaching and repeated so often in his own writing that they start to feel less like ideas and more like reflexes he was trying to build. The first is a discipline of perception, training himself to see events plainly, stripped of the dramatic, catastrophizing story his mind wanted to wrap around them, describing a setback in the barest possible terms rather than the frightening version his imagination preferred. The second is a discipline of action, reminding himself endlessly to act only in service of the wider human community he considered himself part of, to do the actual next right thing in front of him rather than getting lost in resentment or fantasy about how things ought to have gone differently. The third, and perhaps the one he wrestled with hardest, is a discipline of desire, trying to want only what was actually within his control, and to meet everything else, the outcomes of battles, the loyalty of generals, the health of his children, with a kind of open-handed acceptance rather than desperate grasping. Reading the notebook with this framework in mind, what looks at first like repetitive rambling starts to look like something closer to physical therapy for the mind, the same 3 exercises done over and over, because that is simply what training requires. He worries in these pages that he is not living up to his own standards. He catalogues his faults with an honesty that would be uncomfortable to read even from a stranger, let alone from a man ostensibly ruling the known world. He worries about vanity, about the pleasure he still sometimes takes in praise despite years of trying to train himself out of caring what other people think. He worries about impatience, about irritability, about the temptation to snap at people beneath him simply because his position allowed it and no one would ever push back. He worries about resentment toward people who have failed him, and reminds himself that holding a grudge does more damage to the person holding it than to anyone else. He worries about the small, petty satisfaction of being proven right in an argument, and tells himself that winning an argument is rarely worth the cost of the relationship it damages. In one striking passage he catalogues a whole list of temptations he still has to actively resist despite decades of philosophical training: the pull toward suspicion of other people's motives, the pull toward complaining about his circumstances, the pull toward comparing his own struggles unfavorably to an imagined easier life he might have had. He does not present any of this as evidence that his philosophy has failed him. If anything, the opposite, the fact that he still has to fight these same battles, entry after entry, year after year, seems to be exactly what convinces him the fight is worth continuing, since the alternative, abandoning the effort because it has not yet produced permanent victory, would guarantee only that the worse impulses win by default. He notices and records, and then quietly tries to talk himself out of these impulses sentence by sentence, the way a person today might write in a journal at 2 a.m. trying to argue themselves down from anxiety or anger, one shaky logical step at a time. There is something almost unbearably human in watching this happen. We are used to imagining historical greatness as something settled, finished, already achieved, the wise emperor, serene and above it all, dispensing timeless wisdom from a position of total inner peace. What Meditations actually shows us is a man who never fully arrived at that peace, who had to fight for it fresh every single day, sometimes several times a page, because the mind he was working with was exactly as stubborn, defensive, and easily wounded as anyone else's. He is not writing from the mountaintop. He is writing from part way up the climb, out of breath, reminding himself why he started climbing in the first place. Try to imagine what an ordinary day actually looked like for him during these final years. Reports arriving from scouts about tribal movements across the river. Petitions from provincial governors forwarded across hundreds of miles, waiting on decisions only the emperor could make, regardless of how far he was from Rome or how exhausted he had become. Legal cases requiring his personal judgment, since the emperor was the final court of appeal for the entire empire, meaning that even on campaign, in between troop movements, Marcus was expected to sit and adjudicate disputes over inheritance, property, and citizenship for people he would never meet, in provinces he would never visit. Meetings with generals about supply lines strained by years of war and disease. And somewhere in whatever hours were left, usually late at night when the camp had finally gone quiet, the private argument with himself that had become, by this point, less a luxury and more a kind of maintenance, the mental equivalent of a soldier cleaning and checking his own equipment before it could be trusted again in the field. It is worth remembering that Marcus did not have the option modern people have of stepping away from responsibility to recover. There was no retreat available to him, no sabbatical, no lower stakes job to fall back into if the pressure became unbearable. The only tool available to him for managing an unrelenting, life-or-death workload was his own mind, and so the maintenance of that mind became, in the most literal sense, a matter of imperial survival. Some of the most striking passages are the ones where he seems to be talking himself out of despair rather than arrogance. He reflects more than once on how quickly fame fades, how the great men of history, kings and conquerors whose names once filled every mouth in the known world, are now barely remembered, their achievements reduced to a line in a history book or forgotten entirely, their bodies long since scattered into the same handful of elements as everyone else's. He imagines, with an almost eerie calm, his own eventual disappearance from memory, the idea that Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, will one day mean nothing to anyone, his name as forgotten as the names of countless emperors before him whom even he, in his own time, could barely recall. Rather than treating this as a tragedy, he seems to use it as medicine, a way of loosening his grip on his own importance, a reminder that the anxious, status-conscious part of his mind was chasing something that would evaporate regardless of what he achieved. And running underneath almost every page is grief, though he rarely names it directly. Marcus Aurelius fathered at least 13 children with his wife Faustina. Most of them did not survive childhood. Daughter after daughter, son after son, born into the greatest household on earth, with access to the best medical knowledge the ancient world could offer, and still lost one after another to the diseases that no wealth or power could hold back. Of the roughly 13 or 14 children Faustina bore him across their marriage, only a handful survived into adulthood, a mortality rate that would be considered a catastrophe by modern standards, but that was, in the brutal arithmetic of the ancient world, simply an ordinary, expected feature of family life, even at the very top of society. We know some of their names only from inscriptions and funerary records: twin boys who died within a year of birth, a daughter who died at not quite 2 years old, a son, Titus Aurelius Antoninus, who lived barely past infancy, another, Marcus Annius Verus, who seemed for a time to be thriving before dying of what ancient sources describe as a growth behind the ear at around 7 years old, an event some accounts claim Marcus endured with visible composure in public, returning to Senate business within days, precisely because an emperor's grief, unlike an ordinary father's, was not fully his own to express. By the time Marcus was writing his private notes on the frontier, he had already buried the majority of his own children. He rarely writes about this loss explicitly. There is no passage where he breaks down on the page and mourns a specific son or daughter by name, but scholars have long noted how the philosophy he clings to, the endless repeated insistence that nothing which is not truly ours should be allowed to control our peace of mind, that even the people we love most are, in the end, on loan from a universe that owes us nothing, reads less like abstract theory and more like a man building himself a shelter out of ideas, one plank at a time, because the alternative was collapse. His wife, Faustina, was a constant presence through nearly all of this, married to Marcus when she was still a young teenager, at his side through nearly every child born and every child lost, and by his side, according to Roman sources, on at least some of his military campaigns, unusual for an empress of her era. Roman gossip was not always kind to her. Rumors circulated, as they tend to around powerful women in every era of history, about infidelity, about scheming, about her supposed influence over succession. Some of these rumors were almost certainly invented or exaggerated by later writers hostile to the dynasty that eventually followed Marcus. What we know for certain is that in his own private notebook, in the section where he goes through the people he is grateful to and the specific qualities he admires in each of them, Marcus includes his wife and describes her, in his own private words meant for no one else, as obedient, affectionate, and unpretentious, plain, almost understated praise, but praise offered in a document with no possible motive to flatter her for public consumption. Whatever their marriage actually looked like behind the walls of the palace, the man writing in private, with nothing to gain from lying, chose to remember her with warmth. Contrast this private devastation with the public image the world demanded of him. An emperor was not permitted ordinary grief. An emperor was expected to embody stability itself, to reassure a frightened, plague-ravaged, war-exhausted empire that everything remained under control, that Rome's fortune had not turned, that the gods still favored the state. Every letter, every public appearance, every edict had to project a calm that Marcus, if his private notebook is any evidence, did not always feel. You can still see this public performance preserved in stone and metal. Coins minted throughout Marcus's reign show him with the standard imperial iconography of strength and divine favor, laurel wreaths, victory inscriptions, personifications of fortune and providence stamped alongside his profile, regardless of what was actually happening on the frontier that year. The great bronze equestrian statue of him that survives in Rome today, one of the only such statues from antiquity to escape being melted down for its metal in later centuries, depicts him serene, commanding, his hand raised in a gesture some later viewers read as blessing and others read as address to his troops, radiating exactly the kind of untroubled authority the empire needed to see. The column erected in his honor after the Northern Wars, covered top to bottom in carved battle scenes, shows Roman victory after Roman victory, an unbroken narrative of triumph with no visual space allotted anywhere for doubt, exhaustion, or grief. This was the Marcus the empire required, and by every measure of Roman political performance he delivered it convincingly for nearly 2 decades. The gap between the man performing serenity in the Senate House and the man arguing himself down from despair by candlelight in a military tent is, in a strange way, the entire emotional engine of the book. Meditations is what leaks out of that gap. It is the sound of the mask being set down, alone, at the end of the day. The most direct test of everything Marcus had been privately rehearsing came in the year 175, when a false rumor reached the eastern provinces claiming that Marcus had died on the frontier. One of his most trusted generals, a capable and ambitious man named Avidius Cassius, acted on the news immediately, having himself declared emperor by his troops in Egypt and Syria before anyone could confirm whether the rumor was even true. It was, by any ordinary political logic, an act of naked betrayal. A man Marcus had promoted and trusted, seizing power the moment he believed the throne was empty. According to the surviving account, when news of the revolt reached Marcus, he gathered his own troops and addressed them directly rather than hiding the crisis behind closed doors, telling them plainly what had happened and asking, apparently without irony, that they not treat the situation as an occasion for celebration even if the revolt collapsed and Cassius were captured or killed, since a civil war, however it ended, represented a loss for Rome rather than a victory worth cheering. It is a strange thing to say to an army in the middle of a succession crisis, and it is exactly the kind of thing the private notebook spends page after page training a person to be able to say and mean. What Marcus reportedly did next tells you almost everything about which parts of his private philosophy had actually taken root and which remained aspirational. Rather than responding with the fury the situation would have justified, he is said to have expressed regret that Cassius would be denied the chance to see how Marcus intended to handle the situation, meaning, according to the ancient historian who records this, that Marcus hoped to offer clemency rather than execution, to demonstrate that even a usurper could be shown mercy by a ruler who genuinely believed revenge accomplished nothing worth having. He reportedly told his own soldiers that if Cassius could be captured alive, he wanted the chance to reconcile with the man rather than punish him, to ask him only why he had done it, and then to let him go. The question, tragically, was never answered. Cassius's own officers, realizing the revolt was collapsing once it became clear Marcus was very much alive, assassinated him themselves within a few months, apparently hoping to win favor with the emperor by delivering his head. Marcus, by the surviving accounts, took no pleasure in this either. He is said to have refused to view the severed head when it was presented to him, ordering it buried rather than displayed, and he extended clemency to Cassius's family and to the senators who had supported the revolt, going so far as to burn, unread, a cache of letters that would have identified every senator who had secretly corresponded with the usurper, choosing not to know who among his own inner circle had wished him dead, rather than live the rest of his reign suspicious of everyone around him. Whether this reflects genuine equanimity or simply the political calculation of a ruler who understood that mass executions breed more enemies than they eliminate, we cannot fully know. But it is exactly the kind of restraint his private notebook spends page after page trying to talk himself into, and for once, in a moment of real betrayal with real stakes, the philosophy and the man's actual conduct appear to have lined up. There is also, scattered throughout, something closer to tenderness passages where Marcus reminds himself to actually notice the good things around him instead of only fixating on threats and failures. He tells himself to really look at ordinary things with fresh eyes, the way bread splits open when it bakes in a pattern the baker never intended but which turns out beautiful anyway, the way a fig, at the exact moment it becomes overripe, has its own particular kind of loveliness, distinct from the loveliness of an unripe fig, not a failure of the earlier state but a different completion of it. He notices the way ripe olives, just before they begin to spoil, take on a particular darkness and fullness that has its own beauty even though it also signals decay approaching. He notices the way ears of wheat bend under their own weight as they ripen, the way a lion's furrowed brow looks fierce and is also, seen a certain way, simply what a lion's face happens to do, the way foam gathers at the edge of a boar's mouth mid-charge. These are strange, small, almost domestic details for a man commanding legions to be dwelling on, and that is exactly what makes them worth noticing. He seems to be practicing something we would now recognize as an act of deliberate attention, training his mind, exhausted by war and administration and grief, to keep finding small, ordinary reasons that existence is not simply a burden to be endured. It is worth imagining him actually doing this, a middle-aged man in armor, walking past a market stall or a supply wagon, forcing himself to really look at a piece of fruit or a loaf of bread, treating the exercise with the same seriousness he brought to matters of state, because he seems to have genuinely believed that a mind trained in noticing small good things would eventually lose the capacity to notice any good thing at all. Underneath many of these individual reminders sits a bigger idea he keeps circling back to, one borrowed loosely from the older Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that the universe itself is a river, not a monument. Nothing holds still. Every structure he could see around him, the walls of his tent, the legions camped along the frontier, the city of Rome itself, the very idea of an empire that would last forever, was, in his own telling, made of the same restless, changing material as everything else, destined to be dissolved and reassembled into something new, the way a body's own matter is constantly being replaced without the person inside it ever quite noticing. He does not seem to find this thought depressing so much as clarifying. If everything is already in the process of dissolving and reforming, then clinging tightly to the present shape of things, his own health, his own reputation, the survival of his own dynasty starts to look less like strength and more like a kind of category error, gripping a river as though it were a stone. He returns just as often to the idea, borrowed from the wider Stoic tradition, that he was not simply a citizen of Rome but a citizen of the world, a member of a single, vast community that included every rational being, regardless of birth, nationality, or status. This was not an empty sentiment for a man who spent his final years fighting the very peoples this idea theoretically included. It sits uneasily and honestly right alongside his role as a wartime commander, and he seems to know it sits uneasily, returning to the tension rather than resolving it neatly. He reminds himself that his duty as emperor and commander does not cancel his deeper identity as a member of a shared human community, even when circumstances force him to fight against parts of that community. It is one of the places where the private notebook feels most obviously unfinished, not a settled philosophical position, but a man trying to hold two true things at once without letting either one erase the other. He also returns obsessively to a mental exercise historians and philosophers have since nicknamed the view from above. He imagines himself rising up out of his own body, up past the walls of his tent, past the boundaries of the camp, up until the war he is fighting, the empire he is ruling, the entire span of his own life shrinks to the size of a single point on a vast spinning globe, itself only a speck in an incomprehensibly larger universe. From that height he reminds himself, the anger he feels toward a specific general, the anxiety over a specific decision, the ache of a specific loss, all of it becomes almost comically small, one flicker among billions of flickers, most of them already extinguished, most of them soon to be extinguished, all of them equally subject to time. It is not a callous exercise. It does not appear to be an attempt to convince himself that nothing matters. It reads more like an attempt to get enough distance from his own suffering to be able to function inside it, the ancient equivalent of stepping outside for air in the middle of an unbearable meeting, not to escape the problem, but to be able to walk back in and face it clearly. He pushes the same exercise even further in other passages, imagining not just his own life from a great height, but the entire sweep of human history compressed into something almost unbearably brief, empires rising and falling within the span of a single held breath, entire generations of people who once considered their own worries as urgent and consuming as his, now reduced to nothing more than a name on a list if they are remembered at all. He imagines the vast populations of cities he will never visit, all of them convinced in the moment that their own lives are the center of everything, exactly as he is sometimes tempted to believe about his own. There is a kind of vertigo in reading these passages back to back, the sense of a mind deliberately zooming out again and again, as if it had discovered that this particular vantage point, however dizzying, was the only reliable medicine it had found for the specific poison of self-importance that came with ruling an empire. He does not do this to escape responsibility. In the very same entries, he reminds himself to come back down from that height and attend with full seriousness to the actual task directly in front of him, the letter that needs answering, the soldier who needs commanding, the decision that cannot wait. The zooming out and the zooming back in appear to function together, one giving him the perspective to bear the weight, the other keeping him from using that perspective as an excuse to disengage from the world he was actually responsible for. What makes all of this so much stranger and so much more moving, once you remember the basic biographical fact underneath it, none of this was written for us. There was no publisher waiting. There was no audience of students expecting a lecture. There was no legacy being carefully curated for future admirers. Marcus was not, as far as any historian has ever been able to determine, writing a philosophical treatise intended to teach anyone anything. He already knew Stoic philosophy inside and out. He did not need to write himself an introductory textbook. He was doing something closer to what a modern person does when they open a private journal at the end of an unbearable day and simply try to get their thoughts in order enough to face tomorrow. The repetition throughout the book, the way certain ideas about death or anger or the shortness of life appear again and again in slightly different phrasing across different sections, is not the sign of a careless writer. It's the sign of a man returning, night after night exhausted, to the same unresolved arguments with himself, because a single successful pep talk on a single evening does not permanently cure a mind of its oldest fears. He had to keep having the conversation, so he kept writing it down. We don't fully know how the notebook survived. There is no record of Marcus ever mentioning its existence to anyone else in his surviving correspondence. It seems to have circulated in a very limited way after his death, if it circulated at all, and then largely vanished from history for centuries, one of those documents that exists in the historical record almost by accident, save not because anyone recognized its importance at the time, but through the kind of blind luck that has preserved so much and destroyed so much more from the ancient world. The oldest reference we have to it by name comes centuries after Marcus's death. It's entirely possible that the book we now consider one of the most widely read works of philosophy in human history came within a single accident, a single careless scribe, a single library fire, of never reaching us at all. There is one more thread worth pulling on here, because it makes the eventual survival of this notebook feel even more improbable. Marcus's own son, Commodus, succeeded him as emperor in the year 180, breaking the pattern of adoptive succession that had produced Marcus himself and his predecessors, a system that had, by more or less pure accident, delivered a run of unusually capable rulers precisely because each emperor had been free to choose the most suitable successor rather than being bound to a biological heir. Commodus, by contrast, was Marcus's actual son, and his reign is remembered by ancient historians as a sharp and disturbing turn away from everything his father had modeled, a ruler far more interested in gladiatorial spectacle, in fighting in the arena himself dressed as Hercules, in flattery and excess, than in the sober, exhausting labor of administration his father had practiced for 2 decades on the frontier. Later Roman writers, looking back, treated Commodus's reign as the moment the empire's long stretch of stable, capable leadership finally broke, the hinge point after which things began to slide. It is a strange and uncomfortable footnote to Marcus's own private writing, so much of which is devoted to trying to become a better, steadier version of himself. Whatever wisdom he managed to hand down through his notebook, he was, by the historical record, unable to fully transmit it to the one person who inherited his actual throne. The philosophy survived. The dynasty, in the form Marcus might have hoped for, did not. And this is, in a way, the strangest part of the entire story. Marcus Aurelius spent the final years of his life fighting wars whose details most people alive today could not name, defending frontiers that would eventually collapse regardless of what he did, presiding over an empire that was already, in ways he could not have fully seen, past its high point and beginning its long, slow transformation into something else. Almost everything he actually built, the fortifications, the treaties, the administrative reforms, the military victories, had been ground down by 2,000 years of time, war, and forgetting. What survived, almost against the odds, was not the empire. It was the diary. The private, unpolished, repetitive, often self-critical notebook of a man talking himself through his own fear, grief, anger, and doubt, one evening at a time, never imagining a single other person would ever read it. The thin trail by which the notebook actually reached us is worth telling in its own right because it underlines just how close the whole thing came to vanishing. For roughly 1,000 years after Marcus's death, there is almost no clear trace of it in the historical record at all, no ancient library catalogue listing it with confidence, no chain of quotations from other philosophers proving it was being read and copied the way more famous ancient texts were. The first solid reference to a book resembling it comes from a Byzantine bishop and historian named Xiphilinus, writing in the 11th century, nearly 900 years after Marcus's death, who mentions a work by the emperor addressed to himself. Only a handful of manuscript copies from the medieval period are known to have existed at all, and of those, most have since been lost. The text we read today descends from a small number of surviving copies, edited, compared, and reconstructed by scholars piecing together a document that came within a genuinely small margin of disappearing from human memory entirely. The first printed edition did not appear until 1559 in Zurich, more than 14 centuries after Marcus set down his first private reminder to himself in that tent on the Danube. Every single reader since then have been reading a document that survived not because of careful, deliberate preservation by people who understood its value, but through a long, thin, largely accidental chain of custody, the kind of survival that, examined closely, looks less like destiny and more like remarkably good luck. Once it did reach a wider audience, its readers turned out to span an almost bewildering range of temperaments and eras. Renaissance scholars pored over it as a specimen of Stoic philosophy and elegant, unadorned Greek prose. Enlightenment thinkers found in it a model of rational self-governance that fit neatly alongside their own preoccupations with reason and virtue. Military leaders across the centuries reportedly carried copies into their own campaigns, drawn to the image of a commander steadying his mind before facing the same uncertainty they themselves faced. In more recent generations, it has found an entirely new kind of readership among people with no connection to philosophy departments or classical education at all. Athletes, entrepreneurs, soldiers, students, people going through divorce or illness or ordinary bad years, drawn to the same basic promise that seems to have kept Marcus himself returning to the page, that writing plainly to yourself about your fears in language stripped of performance might actually help you get through the next day. The text have been printed in more editions and more languages than nearly any other work to survive from the ancient world, not because it was ever trying to reach that many people, but arguably because it never was. There is something worth noting, too, about the actual language Marcus wrote in, which adds another unexpected layer to the story. Though he was a Roman emperor ruling in a state whose official language was Latin, he wrote his private notebook entirely in Greek, the language of philosophy, education, and elite intellectual culture across the Roman world, but not his native political tongue. This was not unusual for a highly educated Roman of his class. Greek carried the same kind of cultural prestige in his world that classical Latin or, in some circles, French once carried in later European history, the language you reached for when you wanted precision and depth rather than official authority. But it does mean that even the physical act of writing these notes involved a small, private step outside the identity of Roman emperor and into something closer to student of philosophy, the same self he had first put on as a 12-year-old in a coarse cloak decades before anyone imagined he would rule anything at all. The Greek itself, scholars who read it in the original consistently note, is rough compared to the polished, carefully balanced prose of professional Greek writers and orators of the period. It is clipped, compressed, sometimes grammatically awkward, full of the kind of shorthand a person uses when writing quickly for an audience of one. Later translators, working the text into Latin and then into English, French, German, and dozens of other languages over the centuries, have had to make constant small decisions about how much of that roughness to preserve and how much to smooth over into more elegant, readable prose, a reminder that even the version we read today, however moving, is already an interpretation, a polished window built around a genuinely unpolished original. Something is inevitably lost in that smoothing, the same way a transcribed voicemail loses the pauses, the false starts, the specific weight of a real voice thinking out loud. What survives, even in translation, is enough to make clear that this was never meant to sound eloquent. It was meant to work. Modern psychologists and historians of philosophy have noticed with some interest how closely the actual mechanics of this private writing resemble techniques that would later be formalized nearly 2,000 years afterward in cognitive behavioral therapy, the practice of catching an automatic, distressing thought as it arises, examining it plainly, questioning whether it is actually true or simply feels true in the moment, and deliberately replacing it with a more accurate, more workable way of seeing the same situation. Marcus was not, of course, working from any such formal framework. He had never heard of a therapist and would not have understood the concept of one. But the pattern on the page is unmistakable to anyone who has ever kept their own anxious journal. Notice the unhelpful thought, state it honestly, argue against it using evidence and principle, and land, however briefly, on something steadier. He does this with his fear of death. He does this with his anger at specific people who have wronged him. He does this with the temptation toward vanity when he is praised, and with despair when he considers how quickly even the greatest men are forgotten. None of these arguments ever seem to be won permanently. He has to make many of them again, days or weeks later, sometimes in nearly identical language, which is itself the most convincing evidence that this was not performance and not literature but genuine, effortful maintenance of a mind under sustained pressure, no different in kind, if very different in scale, from the maintenance any person today performs when they talk themselves down from a spiral at midnight. There is a particular kind of intimacy in reading something that was never meant to be read. We are used to consuming polished thoughts, speeches, essays, books written with a reader firmly in mind, shaped, revised, made presentable. Meditations offers something almost the opposite of that. It is unfinished in the truest sense. It repeats itself because the man writing it was still working something out, not because he was building toward a rhetorical climax. It contradicts itself in places, doubling back, restating an idea more sharply after failing to convince himself the first time. It never resolves into a single tidy argument because a real mind wrestling with real fear in real time doesn't work that way. Reading it feels less like reading a philosopher and more like reading someone's actual diary, the kind you might stumble across after a loved one has died, filled with worries you never knew they carried, doubts that never made it into a single conversation while they were alive. And perhaps this is exactly why it still resonates 2,000 years later with people whose lives could not look more different from his. Almost no one reading these words today commands legions or rules an empire. Almost no one is managing a plague sweeping across a continent, or grieving a dozen dead children, or holding together a civilization on the edge of collapse. And yet the actual content of his private worries, the fear that he isn't living up to his own standards, the frustration with people who behave badly, the low background hum of anxiety about mortality, the daily, unglamorous struggle just to get out of bed and do the work in front of him, these are not the worries of an emperor. These are the worries of a person. Underneath the purple robes and the legions and the 2,000 years of historical distance, Marcus Aurelius was doing something achingly ordinary, trying to be a slightly better version of himself than he had been the day before, and mostly failing, and getting up the next morning to try again anyway. That, in the end, may be the real reason his private notebook outlived his empire. Empires are built by force, and force eventually meets a stronger force. But a man honestly documenting his own struggle to be decent, patient, and unafraid, in language stripped of all performance because he never expected an audience, that turns out to be something rarer and something far harder to destroy. Rome fell. The frontiers he spent his life defending were eventually overrun by the very tribes he spent decades fighting. The philosophy schools that trained him were eventually closed. And still, centuries later, in languages he never spoke, on devices he could not have imagined, people find themselves reading his private reminders to be patient, to expect less from other people and more from themselves, to remember that everything ends and that this is not, in itself, a reason for despair, and they feel, uncannily, as though someone understands exactly what they are going through. He was not writing to be remembered. He was writing to survive one more day of being human, inside a body and a mind exactly as fragile as anyone else's, dressed for reasons that had very little to do with who he actually was on the inside, in the clothes of the most powerful man alive. Maybe that's the real story here, not a wise old emperor handing down timeless truths from some untouchable height, but a frightened, grieving, exhausted man, alone in a tent on a cold frontier, doing the same thing so many of us do in our own worst nights, picking up something to write with, and trying, sentence by sentence, to talk himself into believing he could make it through to morning. He did make it through, night after night, for nearly 2 decades of nearly unbroken crisis, until he finally died in the year 180, reportedly at a military camp near modern Vienna or Sirmium. Accounts differ on the exact location, still on that same northern frontier that had occupied so much of his adult life, far from the city he had been born in and the libraries where he had first fallen in love with philosophy as a boy. Ancient sources describe his final illness as sudden, and note that he refused food and water for the last days of his life, apparently to hasten an end he recognized was coming regardless, a final small act of choosing rather than simply waiting to be chosen for. He is said to have summoned his son Commodus to his bedside and urged him, with whatever strength remained, to finish the war rather than abandon it, advice his son would very quickly disregard once the throne was actually his. Marcus reportedly asked one of the attending officers for the day's watchword, in an echo of the very same ritual by which Antoninus Pius had died decades earlier, and then, according to the account, covered his own head with his cloak, as though settling into sleep, and died during the night that followed. He never finished his private argument with himself. There was no final entry that tied everything together, no last triumphant sentence declaring the struggle won. The notebook simply stops, the way a person's thoughts simply stop mid-conversation when there is no more time left to keep having them. And maybe that unfinished quality is the most honest ending it could have had, because the struggle he was recording was never actually going to be finished. It wasn't a problem to be solved once and then set aside. It was the ongoing daily labor of trying to remain a good and steady person inside a life that kept handing him reasons not to be: grief, fear, exhaustion, power, flattery, war, disease, loss upon loss upon loss. He never claimed to have mastered it. He only claimed to be trying, again, tonight, the same as he had tried the night before. Which is perhaps the closest thing to wisdom that any of us ever actually get to hold. Not a finished state of peace, arrived at once and kept forever. Just the willingness to sit down again at the end of another difficult day and have the same necessary argument with yourself one more time, quietly, honestly, with no one else ever expected to be listening. There is a small, quiet detail worth ending on. Somewhere in his private notes, Marcus reminds himself that it is entirely possible to live a good life even in a palace, even surrounded by every temptation toward vanity and cruelty that unlimited power makes available. He does not say this as a boast. He says it as a private challenge to himself, a reminder that his circumstances, however extreme, were not an excuse. He seems to have understood better than most people in his position ever managed to, that power does not simply reveal character, it stress tests it, applying pressure at exactly the points where a person is most likely to break: vanity, cruelty, self-indulgence, the temptation to stop listening to anyone who might disagree. He was not naturally immune to any of these pressures. Nothing in the notebook suggests he believed himself to be. What he seems to have believed, and what he kept trying to prove to himself one entry at a time, was that a person could notice these pressures as they arrive, name them honestly, and choose again and again not to be shaped by them. Whether he fully succeeded is not really the point, and it's probably not even answerable at 2,000 years removed through the fog of ancient biography, propaganda, and the flattering distortions that tend to accumulate around the record of anyone in power. What we actually have is not a verdict on whether Marcus Aurelius was a good man. What we have is something rarer and, in its own way, more useful, an honest transcript of what trying looks like, hour by hour, from the inside, written by someone with no reason to lie about it because no one else was ever supposed to read it. Most of history hands us finished monuments, statues, triumphal arches, official portraits designed to project unwavering strength. This one document hands us something else entirely: the scaffolding still up, the unfinished plaster still wet, the private, unglamorous labor that finished monuments are usually built to hide. Maybe that is the real reason people keep returning to it, generation after generation, in circumstances Marcus could never have predicted and would probably have found bewildering. Not because it offers a formula for becoming invincible to hardship. It offers no such thing, and never pretends to. It offers something smaller and, in the end, far more honest proof that even the most powerful, most burdened, most publicly composed person of his entire world still had to sit down, alone, in the dark, and talk himself into trying again tomorrow. If he needed that, so does everyone else. And somehow, knowing that a Roman emperor once needed exactly the same quiet, unglamorous pep talk that gets an ordinary person through their own worst nights makes the whole difficult project of being human feel a little less lonely than it did before.